Hello and welcome to the new plan. I'm Joe Monk. I'm the person that created your plan. I'm the person that's going to help you throughout your journey. And today we're talking about the energy balance. Now, if there was only one subject that I could talk to you about, or one thing that you could learn from the new plan, it would be the energy balance. Essentially, it's how calories result in fat loss or fat gain, or your body fat staying exactly the same. Now, before we get onto the energy balance, we need to talk about calories. Now, calories, as we all know, are found in the food and drink that we consume. But what do? Well, essentially, they're fuel for our body. And without that fuel, our bodies would not be able to function. Every cell in the human body requires energy, and we get that energy from calories. So the first big question is, how many calories do you need? And to work this out, we need to look at something called your calorie expenditure, which is essentially how many calories you have leaving your body and how many calories you use each day. So your total calorie expenditure is made up of four main factors. The first of which is BMR, which is your basal metabolic rate. Imagine you slept for an entire day. This is how many calories your body would require performing basic bodily functions. Things like breathing, organ function, blood circulation, and cellular activity. Your BMR is largely dependent on height, weight, muscle mass, gender, age, genetics, and dietary history. Generally speaking, the bigger and more powerful the body, the higher your basal metabolic rate, much like how a bigger and more powerful engine requires more fuel. Next up on the list is NEAT, which stands for non-exercise activity thermogenesis. It sounds complicated, but it's really quite simple. These are the calories you expend through basic physical activity. Basically anything that requires movement but isn't quite exercise. If you're more active and spend a lot of the day walking, your NEAT will be higher than someone that spends a lot of the day sitting down. Next up is EAT, which stands for exercise activity thermogenesis. Simply put, EAT is the number of calories you expend through exercise. And lastly, we've got TEF, which stands for the thermic effect of food. This is how many calories your body burns whilst digesting food. Food that is more difficult to break down, such as food high in protein or fiber, will have a higher thermic effect than food that breaks down quite easily, such as refined carbs and foods that are heavily processed. So now we know the four factors that make up calorie expenditure, but how do we turn all of this into a number? Specifically, how many calories you need? Well, to do this, we need a formula. And the formula that I used is the Harris-Benedict equation. Now, this is seen as the most accurate equation there is for working out how many calories you need. However, I used a slightly altered version, which takes muscle mass into account, as it's something that isn't actually considered in the initial formula. Now, I know you're thinking, how accurate is this formula? Now, truth be told, it is a good starting point, and for 90% of people, it's probably going to be just about spot on. However, for that small percentage, we may need to make some alterations after the first month of you being on the plan. The reason for this is that we're never going to be able to work out the number of calories you need exactly. There are just too many variables that come into play, and there are a number of things that we just cannot measure, such as genetics or hormones, or dietary history. We can't put a number to those kind of things, so we can't input that information into a formula. So now we know how many calories that you need, we can look at adapting that in line with your goals. And for this, I'm going to show you a little example. So if we were to look at the average female with a calorie expenditure of 2,000 calories, now if she was to consume exactly 2,000 calories, she would enter a state known as maintenance. This means that she's got as many calories coming in as she's got going out. And the end result is that fat stores stay exactly the same. She doesn't gain or lose any body fat. Now, if we were to increase calorie consumption above maintenance, we would enter something called a calorie surplus. This means the body has more calories than it actually needs. And the only way it can get rid of these extra calories is by storing it as body fat. This is how you gain body fat. And lastly, if calorie consumption is below maintenance, we enter something called a calorie deficit. This means that the body isn't getting all the energy it needs through food. So what does the body do? Well, it turns to a secondary source of energy, body fat, and this is how the body loses fat. Now, something we do need to consider is that the greater your surplus or the greater your deficit, the more calories you're going to gain or lose. However, when it comes to a calorie deficit, we don't want your calories to be too low. I like to set the bare minimum at about 1,200 to 1,300 calories, and this is for a few reasons. Number one, it's going to be very difficult to keep to. Consuming less than 1,300 calories is very difficult. You're going to get very hungry, and in the long term, it's just not sustainable. Secondly, when your calories are too low, there can be some implications. For a start, you can lose muscle, which is something you definitely do not want. The reason this happens is that your body gets so desperate for calories, gets so desperate for energy, that it starts breaking down muscle fibers and using that for energy. Now, muscle is hard to put on and it also contributes quite a lot towards your metabolism. So this isn't something that you want to lose. So the best range for your calorie deficit when it comes to fat loss is usually around 10 to 20% below your maintenance calories. So for the average female with maintenance calories around 2,000 calories, you'd want to set their fat loss calories between 1,600 to 1,800 calories, with 1,600 calories producing fat loss at about 1 pound of fat per week. Now, it's not all about body fat. Calorie intake also has a big impact on the rate at which you build muscle. Now, whilst it's possible for someone to develop muscle whilst on a calorie deficit, the greater the deficit, the more difficult it is. And if that deficit is too low, as I spoke about earlier, your muscles can actually start getting broken down as a way of producing energy. On the other hand, whilst putting your body in a calorie surplus puts you in the best position for muscle growth, 99% of the time you will also gain some body fat. To limit the amount of fat you gain, a surplus is usually around the 10% range above your maintenance calories. So that's it, that's the energy balance. If you've got any questions, drop me a message on WhatsApp or you can drop a message in our Facebook group.